So good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. I will be presenting on biodiversity change and EBVs, or essential biodiversity variables. So I'm Laetitia Navarro. I'm presenting from Leipzig in Germany. I am a conservation biologist by training, but most importantly, I'm the executive secretary of GEO BON, the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. And today I'll be talking about the development of essential variables to monitor global biodiversity change, or essential biodiversity variables. But first, to put things into context, I will probably not surprise you by saying that we're undergoing a biodiversity crisis. This has been documented largely in the media and in the scientific literature. And in fact, the degree of ecosystem degradation and the observed decreases in populations of wild species have led some scientists to question if we have reached a sixth-mass extinction. The good news, so to speak, is that at the same time, we're also witnessing some strong commitments for biodiversity. And this is exemplified with the many multilateral environmental agreements that have been signed in the past decades, such as the UN CBD, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, or more recently, the establishment of EBVs, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The establishment of those multilateral environmental agreements is oftentimes accompanied by the design of sets of targets and goals at the global and national level that are meant to guide effective biodiversity conservation. And concretely, what this means is that if countries want to be able to assess whether they're on track to achieve those targets, they also need access to timely and relevant biodiversity data. But the problem is that this is much easier said than done. One reason for that is that we're still facing important knowledge gaps when it comes to biodiversity. There's important spatial gaps, as you can see on this map on the left-hand side. This map shows you the locations or the points that are used to calculate the Living Planet Index, which is a widely used indicator of the state of biodiversity. And you can see that while the distribution of those points is pretty good globally, it is still suboptimal. There's still a lot of areas where we don't have information on the state of biodiversity, at least based on the points that are used to calculate this indicator. There's also important temporal gaps, and it's quite difficult for us, for instance, to get our hands on good time series on biodiversity that would predate the 1970s or 1960s. And on top of that, there's also important taxonomic gaps. This is what you can see here on this map on the right-hand side that shows you the distribution of sampling sites for soil biodiversity. And again, you can see that the distribution of those points is not optimal. So in this context, when you have on the one hand a demand for more data and information, and on the other hand all the knowledge gaps that I just mentioned, you'll understand why there's been over the years several calls for an improvement in the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. And this was meant to serve several users, not just the scientific community, but also decision and policy makers. So this is how the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network, or GEO BON, was established 12 years ago in 2008. The long-term vision of GEO BON was to establish a global coordinated biodiversity observation network that can contribute to effective management policies for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And to support GEO BON's missions and vision, 5 years after its establishment, the framework for the essential biodiversity variables was proposed in 2013. We define those essential biodiversity variables, or EBVs, as a minimum set of measurements that are complementary to one another and that can capture major dimensions of biodiversity change. In other words, this means that EBVs are biological and policy relevant. They have to be sensitive to change. They're biological state variables. They have to be generalizable across realms to the best extent possible, and this means marine, freshwater, and terrestrial. They also have to be scalable and, of course, feasible. And those EBVs are organized around 6 classes that cover all levels of organization of biodiversity: the genetic composition, species population, species traits, community composition, ecosystem structure, and ecosystem function. Another way to look at those EBVs is to see them as the level of integration between primary observations, for instance, remote sensing or in situ observations, and higher level indicators of biodiversity change. And the blueprint of the development of EBVs is what I'll refer to as the EBVs workflows, and is generally organized around several steps: the collection of primary observations, the standardization of primary observations, then the integration of data and model-based estimation, and finally the publication of datasets following the GEO BON data guidelines. So within our network, GEO BON members are now working on defining the essential biodiversity variables, or EBVs, within each class, and describing the workflows to produce the EBV data products. In particular, progress was made in recent years to conceptualize essential biodiversity variables for species traits and for species populations. And you can see here two examples of workflows to produce those EBVs. So I will not get into details, of course, but I invite you to check those two publications if you're curious about the process of defining EBVs and the workflows for different dimensions of biodiversity. One critical point is that the EBV datasets then needs to be published ensuring the FAIR principles. So they have to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And it also became clear quite quickly that we needed a minimum information standard for the EBVs if we wanted to facilitate the reporting, the harmonization, and the streaming of the EBVs. So our team at the GEO BON Secretariat is now developing the new version of the EBV data portal in order to make EBV datasets available. And this portal is going to be composed of an EBV catalog for indexing and a spatial browser for visualization and analysis or summary of information. And we're finalizing the new version of this portal that should be ready in a couple of weeks. Another important milestone for this year and in general in the development of the EBVs is a project that we started a little less than a year ago and that we call the EBV 2020 initiative. And the idea behind this project was to ask what are the EBV data products that are already available or that could be ready by the summer of 2020 and that could be mobilized in the EBV data portal. So this initiative was organized around two workshops where we brought together, I would say, a little over 60 members of the networks that are working on the development of individual EBV data products. And we started by identifying, with the help of the participants, a little over 70 candidate EBV datasets. And we then narrowed it down to a list of a little over 50 datasets that would match the definition of an EBV and the criteria that I listed a little earlier. So now we're in the process of following up with the data developers so that we can mobilize those datasets. And in particular, we are now prioritizing the datasets based on their policy relevance, which is a perfect segue into my next point. Because as I mentioned to you at the beginning of this presentation, in the case of GEO BON, one of the key end user is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. And in general, the policy relevance of the outputs of GEO BON is something that is very important to us. So early on, when the EBV framework was first proposed, there was an effort that was made to assess to which extent the EBVs could be useful and relevant to track progress towards the achievement of the Aichi targets of the CBD. The Aichi targets is a set of 20 targets for biodiversity conservation for 2020. And indeed, those EBVs were relevant. The EBVs are relevant to track progress towards most of the Aichi targets. More concretely, GEO BON and members have been developing a suite of global biodiversity change indicators that are more specifically designed to track progress towards 5 of these Aichi targets. And those indicators that are EBV-based have been formally endorsed by the CBD. And some of these indicators have also been used in the global assessment of EPES that was published last year in the summer of 2019. At the moment, this year, the CBD and the parties of the CBDs are now discussing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and GEO BON is, of course, engaging also in this progress, including by identifying the relevance of EBVs and EBV-derived indicators for this post-2020 biodiversity framework. Similarly, we can also ask if and how the EBVs can be useful to track progress towards the achievement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, EBVs would be relevant for SDG 14, life below water, and SDG 15, life on land, but not only. EBVs could also be relevant to track progress towards the achievement of SDG 2, zero hunger, or SDG 3, for instance, on health. So now I wanted to go back to the EBV framework, and you'll acknowledge that there's a rather important part of the equation that I have left out until now, which is the collection of the primary observations. And of course, without these collection efforts, there would be no EBV and no indicators of biodiversity change. This is why one of the core activities of GEO BON, aside from the development of the EBVs, is also the development of the bonds, or biodiversity observation networks. And the mission of those bonds is to contribute to the collection and analysis of harmonized biodiversity observations and to develop integrated and interoperable biodiversity monitoring programs. Within GEO bonds, those bonds are organized at different levels. So we have 3 thematic bonds, the marine bond, the freshwater bond, and the soil bond. We have 3 national bonds in China, France, and Colombia. And we have 3 regional bonds in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Arctic, and in the Americas. And of course, these are not the only biodiversity monitoring system out there, but those are the ones that have gone through the formal process of endorsement for bonds that GEO BON has put in place. Now, I wanted to conclude this presentation with some thoughts on the operationalization of the development of the EBVs, looking at the structure of the GEO BON network. This structure was adopted in 2016 at the beginning of the second phase of implementation of GEO BON. And this structure really reflects our focus around the development of the EBVs and the development of the bonds. So what's interesting here is that each of the EBV classes, each of the 6 classes, has a dedicated working group. We also have a working group focusing on ecosystem services. And one thing I haven't mentioned until now is that this working group is working on the conceptualization of the framework for the Essential Ecosystem Services variable, or EESVs. And within our structure, as you can see, we also have room, of course, for the development of the biodiversity observation networks that are focusing on the collection of biodiversity observations, among other things. We also have a working group here, that the bond development working group, that is acting as a bridge between the two. And on top of that, we also chose to establish some task forces that are focusing on cross-cutting issues relevant to all working groups and bonds, for instance, remote sensing, policy support, and data management. And I think that having this structure has really helped us to push forward the development of the essential biodiversity variables, because having this structure, there's a distribution of responsibilities and expertise around the development of the different products for the different EBV classes, but we also have mechanisms that support interactions between the working groups focusing on EBVs, but also with the biodiversity observatories. Now, if you want to know more about what we do and how we do it, I invite you to join our Open Science Conference and All Hands meeting, which will be fully virtual, as you can imagine, and that will be organized in a couple of weeks at the beginning of July. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.